Hello, fourth graders. This is Mrs. Flynn, and this is Geometry Lesson 5. In Lesson 4, we talked about perpendicular and parallel lines. So parallel lines are lines that stay the same distance apart and continue on. Perpendicular lines are lines that cross, or in geometry we say intersect each other at a right angle. So these are perpendicular. These are perpendicular. And these two lines are perpendicular to each other. So today we're going to talk about quadrilaterals. So that is the second learning intention. Classify two-dimensional figures, which means that you can group two-dimensional figures based on their properties. And the way we do that is we look at whether or not these quadrilaterals, which are four-sided shapes, what kind of parallel lines they have or perpendicular lines, and what kind of angles we find in quadrilaterals. So let's turn to the quadrilateral page. And the first thing that we're going to do is figure out what is the definition of a quadrilateral. Your learning intention is that I can classify two-dimensional figures or shapes based on the presence or absence of the different kinds of lines and the different kinds of angles. A quadrilateral is a shape with four sides. So in our pictures down here, we have different types of quadrilaterals. It's any shape with four sides. And there's another word that we need to know for this page, and that word is congruent. C-O-N-G-R-U-E-N-T. And then I'm going to put a colon. A colon is these two dots, and that typically means that a definition is going to follow. Congruent means identical or an exact copy. Okay, when I do vocabulary words, I like to highlight the word, so I know that that is a word that I need to remember. Quadrilateral and congruent. We need to know congruent because if you look at a square has four congruent sides. The sides of a square, in order for it to be a square, have to be identical. They're all the same length. So we say in geometry that a square has congruent sides. If you look at a rectangle, the left side and the right side are congruent, and the top side and the bottom side are congruent. So we're classifying based on what we see about the lines and the angles in each one of these shapes. So how do we know if it is a square? A square has four congruent sides. So when it's says it's looking at the lines, by lines it means it's looking at the lines that make up the sides. Okay, now we're also looking at whether or not the lines are parallel or congruent, and a square has two sets of parallel lines. So we kind of just imagine that these are lines. The top and the bottom are parallel, and the left and the right are parallel to each other. So we have two sets, and that just means pairs, two pairs of parallel sides. Okay, what do we notice about the angles in a square? In a square, we have all right angles. So in order for us to call this a square, the shape has to have four right. And remember, a right angle is a 90-degree angle. Four right angles. Okay, let's look at the rectangle. Very similar to the square. We have two pairs of congruent sides. This pair, they are identical, and the top and the bottom are identical. So we have two pairs or sets of congruent sides. Okay, and then we have two sets of parallel lines. The top and the bottom are parallel to each other, and the left and the right. Two sets of parallel sides. And then look at the angles. What kind of angles are in a rectangle? And it's just like the square. In order for this to be a rectangle, it has four right angles. Okay, and you see as we continue that we don't have any more right angles. These other shapes are kind of like if you've taken a square and you've tilted it or stretched it, and now we have acute angles and obtuse angles. So our next shape is called a rhombus. Sometimes we think we call this a diamond, because if a rhombus is standing up this way, it looks like a diamond shape. But the correct geometry, math, vocabulary term for this shape is a rhombus. So if we look at the sides, all of the sides are the same length. It's kind of like you took a square and you squished it one way. So we have four congruent sides. And remember, congruent means identical. So in this case, identical means that we have sides that are identical in length. And we have two sets of parallel lines. So if I continued these lines, you can see that the left and the right are parallel to each other, and the top and the bottom are parallel to each other. So two sets of parallel lines. Two sets of parallel lines or two sets of parallel sides. Now, what kind of angles do we see in the rhombus? I see two acute angles. Remember, acute angles are less than 90 degrees, and two obtuse angles, 2 acute angles, and 2 obtuse angles. Okay, our next shape is a parallelogram. A parallelogram has 2 congruent sides, left and right, and 2 congruent sides, top and bottom. So the sides are the same length. 2 pairs of congruent sides. And then what can we say about whether or not the sides are parallel? So yes, the top and the bottom are parallel to each other, and the left and the right are parallel to each other. So it's really very similar to a rhombus, except that in a rhombus, all the sides are the same length, and a parallelogram is like a stretched out rhombus. So we have 2 sets of parallel lines. And what kind of angles do we have? Again, we have 2 acute angles and 2 obtuse angles. 2 acute, 2 obtuse. Okay, let's look at the trapezoid. And I just want to remind you another time that if I am writing too fast for you or you get behind, that you can rewind this video or pause it to catch up with me. Okay, now we have a trapezoid, and you can see that the top and the bottom are different lengths, but the left and the right are congruent. They are the same length. So all different kinds of special quadrilaterals. Quadrilateral, by the way, quad means 4, like quarter, 4 quarters in a dollar. Or sometimes we call an ATV a quad because it has 4 wheels. So quad is a prefix that means 4. Trapezoid has 1 set of parallel lines, the top and the bottom. They stay the same distance apart. But on the left and the right, if we extended these, eventually they would intersect. 1 pair of parallel lines, or 1 set of parallel sides. Now let's look at our angles. Now we have acute angles down in the bottom corners and obtuse angles up at the top. 2 acute and 2 obtuse, and maybe a right angle, which I will draw for you after we finish writing this. 2 acute angles and 2 obtuse angles. Okay, now my notes say that it is possible to have a trapezoid with a right angle. So let me see if I can draw that. Okay, we still have to have a pair of parallel sides, parallel lines. So the top and the bottom are parallel. And if I connect it here, then I could have a right angle and connect it like this. So that would still be a trapezoid as long as it has a pair of parallel lines. It's still a four-sided shape. Okay, so there is only one page for this lesson. So if you want to take a highlighter or your markers, you could outline some of these shapes. I'll highlight my square, highlight my rectangle, highlight my rhombus if you want to add a little color to your page. Okay, using your highlighter or your colors to accent what is important for each one of these is always a good idea. So that is the end of lesson 4. That's the end of lesson 4. And there will be a supplementary or extra video posted about quadrilaterals with your assignment. So watch that video too. And tomorrow for the next lesson, we will talk about triangles. Let me see, did I say lesson 4? So lesson 1 was the intro. Lesson 2 is points and lines. Lesson 3 is angles. Lesson 4 is lines. So if I said lesson 4 at the beginning, oops, I meant this is lesson 5. And lesson 6 will be about triangles. So I'll write that down for myself so I remember that tomorrow.